Okay. That's what we're doing. You're getting two for the price of one. That's not bad. All right, everybody. Today is, we are in Chumash Bamidbar. We are in the book of Numbers. And this past week was Parshas Korah. But this coming week, we're doing a double portion, Chukas and Balak. Okay, sometimes it's together, this sometimes it's a double portion. This week is a double portion, correct. The Shabbat coming is, what are you saying with the Kohen? He's already getting excited. What? Well, actually, you'll find out that the aliyos are elongated, which means usually on a regular Shabbat, 7 people are called up before the final person who gets the Haftorah, the reading of the Book of Prophets. So when you have a double portion, you actually have, if you have a Chumash, I'll show you what I'm talking about. They're elongated. So Parshas Chukas begins on page 838 in your handy art scroll. So normally if Chukas is by itself, you go to page 840. 840 on the right-hand side in the margin, it says Sheni, which means the second aliyah. You can get a Chumash. You have a Chumash? Okay. Yeah, I see it. But if you go to page 842, you'll see in the margin on the right, it says Shalishi, the third aliyah, but then in brackets, it says Sheni, which means that when it's two portions together, then this is where the second aliyah ends. So the Kohen aliyah is longer. First side. All right? Because we still have only 7 aliyahs, but it's spread out over the two portions. So
2 sections for 2 parts for one aliyah. Is that what you're saying?
Right. I mean, it's not exactly the way it looks here, but take a look at here on 842 in the margin, Shlishi Sheni. Go to 844, it's Rabbi, the 4th aliyah, and then you go to 846, it's Chamishi, which would be the 5th aliyah when it's by itself, and then Shalishi, the 3rd aliyah when it's together. Then 850 is Shishi, 6th aliyah by itself, but then 852 has Shavi'i, the 7th aliyah when it would be by itself, together with Ravi'i, the 4th aliyah when it's together. And Ravi'i goes straight through into Balak, the second portion. And if you look on page 858 in your handy art scroll Chumash, you'll see that it says Sheni, the second aliyah, and Chamishi, which means that if it was separate, this would be the second aliyah for Balak, but when it's together, it's Chamishi, the 5th aliyah when it's combined. Yes?
So kind of slower like a color. So if it's combined,
Yeah.
is it 1 part, 2 parts of the same, the Chukas like together, or a part of the Chukas and part of the
No, you just, they're elongated. So you're getting a bigger portion in whichever Chumash you're in. The only portion that gets a little bit of both is Ravi, because you finish off Chukas and you go straight into Balak.
And you're able to hit both. Elongated, always elongated.
What do you mean, who's able to hit both? The congregation is listening to both portions this week. Okay? Everyone get it? Okay, so let's get into a little bit of Parshas Chukas. Chukas has 3 commandments, thank you. So we're going to talk about different types of mitzvos, different types of commandments. And remember what we said, a mitzvah is not just a good deed, it's a commandment. There are 365 negative commandments, mitzvahs lo saseh, and 248 positive commandments. So it's interesting, the 365 negative match the days in the solar calendar, and the 248 match the amount. I'm sorry? I put one down there, maybe I didn't put two here. It's Chukas and Balak, you have two there. Right. So we have 365 negative commands that correspond to the days of the solar calendar, and 348 corresponds to the parts of and limbs in a person. So that's one way of splitting the mitzvahs, the positive commandments and the negative commandments. We'll talk about examples of that. Would be a positive commandment would be to give charity, give tzedakah, or to eat matzah on Pesach. A negative commandment would be don't mix milk and meat together, or saying hurtful words to somebody. So those are two negative commandments. So those are another way of dividing the mitzvahs would be the mitzvahs between man and God, and man and his fellow man. Right? Shaking a lulav and esrog on the holiday of Sukkot is a commandment between God and man and God. Excuse me. Doing an act of loving kindness is a commandment between man and a fellow man. And that's another way of dividing the mitzvahs. Now, I do want to mention, we mentioned the 613 commandments. Many of them are not relevant today because we don't have the temple. So today we have 194 negative and 77 positive, a total of 271. Including plus another 7 rabbinic, which includes, for example, Hanukkah and Purim and making blessings. So we have much less now. So that's another way of dividing it. The mitzvahs like we have today, like for example, the mitzvah of Torah study, and the mitzvahs that we have that we don't have today, like bringing sacrifices to the temple. So we have another way of dividing mitzvahs, and that is some are testimonials, like Shabbos is a testimonial that God created the world, and some of the holidays are there to remind us about God taking us out of Egypt. Other mitzvahs are mishpatim, which are laws which govern how we live, not to steal, not to kill. And then there are mitzvahs called chukim, which means a mitzvah that is not logical on its own. We wouldn't have come up with it on its own. So the question is, when we have a mitzvah that we don't have a reason for it, is it incomprehensible that we just can't know the reason? Or is it, the term I use is super rational, beyond understanding? So let's look at both sides of the coin. God could say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, even though it makes no sense at all to you, to show your commitment to me. But in fact, we know that the mitzvahs that God gives us all have deep meaning and multi-levels of understanding. But the reason we do it, the primary reason we should do it, is because God commanded us. That's the primary reason. For example, we know that Jews don't eat pork. It's not a kosher animal. Why? Because God said so. Now, for many years, Jews were mocked in Europe for not eating pork because that was a staple. Then they saw, pork has trichinosis. Maybe that's why Jews are not eating it. Now, is that the reason? No, because even though you could have pork today without trichinosis, we still don't eat it. Circumcision and the law of bris milah and taras hamishpacha, the family purity, reduce cervical cancer in women. Is that the reason? No, but that's an outcome. The reason is because God commanded us. So this week's portion, we talk about the para aduma, the red heifer. The red heifer is a very rare cow that is all red, and it was used to purify those people that that became ritually unclean by coming in contact with a dead body. Somebody comes in contact with a dead body, they become ritually unclean and cannot enter into the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash or to the temple, which is why we're not allowed to go onto the Temple Mount. There's a lot of controversy now because there are parts maybe you could go or not go, and the Arabs are very upset because they made a mosque there, which the Arabs, by the way, have a tendency of doing any holy place where Jews revere the place. They put a mosque on top of it, so they have dibs on it. So actually, as a matter of fact, a lot of the stuff that the Muslims are doing on the Temple Mount is trying to excavate any remembrance of the temple that was there. So that's just a separate issue. Yeah.
Like an archaeological site, can they do that?
They can, well, unfortunately, when the Israelis conquered, I should say redeemed Jerusalem in 1967, they didn't want to ruffle the Arabs' feathers, so they gave them control over the Temple Mount, which I think was a mistake, but that's what they did. And therefore they pretty much are able to do what they want. And if, like now, some Jews want to go onto it, which I don't think they should, but some Jews want to go onto it, it causes riots and it gets complicated. But be that as it may, so why do we have the para aduma? It's a chok. It's something that we don't have a reason for. However, we can get some good insights that could be helpful to us. So, Ramosha Darshan says an interesting thing. What happens if in the palace, the maidservant's baby makes a mess on the floor in the palace room? The baby has a dirty diaper. So what happens? The king says, call the mother, let the mother clean up the mess, right? So Ramosha Darshan says that the Jews made a mistake with the golden calf. So now let the red heifer come and clean up the mess that the calf made. So how does the red heifer clean up the mess? So a deeper understanding of this is, why did they make the mistake of the golden calf? Anybody?
Trying to make it like a different God.
No, they didn't want a different God.
They weren't hearing back soon enough
From
Moses.
Moshe. They thought Moshe wasn't coming, so they wanted an intermediary with God, right? So they were using logic. So, but the logic was faulty because they miscalculated when Moshe would come back. So now, how do you rectify that? You do the mitzvah of the paraduma without logic. You suspend logic a little bit. Don't think about it so much. All right. So that's one understanding of it. Another way of understanding that paraduma is a chok is something that we don't understand why we have it, is the Kohanim involved in the process of purifying the people who had the Kohanim who were in charge of the process of purifying the people who had become ritually unclean by touching a dead body. Some of them became ritually unclean. So the thing that was purifying became ritually unclean. Something like, I'll make a bad comparison of the mop that used to clean the floor gets dirty. So here the Kohanim that did the work to purify the people who were ritually became, that's also like, how does this thing that is purifying, make people tamei.
So what does the red heifer do then to purify?
The red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer are used to be sprinkled on the person who becomes ritually unclean from touching a dead body.
What is the red heifer?
The ashes.
Oh, it's burned as a korban and then.
And the ashes are used with the whole process, which we'll get into a little bit with cedar wood and grass and sprinkled on the person who is ritually unclean. So there is a fascinating piece from the oral tradition about the paraduma, which is related to a famous question that many people ask. How could the righteous suffer, and how come the wicked have good stuff happening to them? The age-old question. Suffering of the innocent and the reward of the righteous. So, what's Christianity's answer to that? And there was a rabbi who unfortunately had a child, very sick, and he wrote a very, very popular book that unfortunately is not Judaism, but he wrote Why the Good Suffer. And basically, the answer is really a Christian one that he had, which is there's God who tries his best, and then there's the devil who does the bad stuff. And the idea is that they both are fighting for who's going to be in charge. The Torah view is, no, there's one God. There's no evil that is separate from God. There's stuff that happens, it's also from God. A loving and caring God. We don't understand it necessarily, but it's still from one God. And it's not two entities. It's not, God and the devil. It's not two separate entities. There is a positive inclination, there's a negative inclination, but they're all on the payroll of God. So want to hear the difference between the two? Very important idea. So that's what the oral tradition tells us is part of what the red heifer is all about. It's purifying something that is ritually unclean, and at the same time, something that's ritually unclean, it makes it impure, to talk about this dilemma of the ability for one entity to help us realize that one entity, one God, can in fact do justice and mercy at the same time, can do negative things and positive things at the same time. It's not two separate entities.
So, if your baby is born with both sexes.
What? How did we get to that? I am not sure. There was a little jump there, but go ahead.
So I say God did it perfectly, but yet a child is born with both sexes together.
Well, again, yeah, we have to get into the medical aspect. What does that mean? The child is really, how does the child have both sexes?
It happens.
Okay, then there's a reason for it. I don't know. I can't tell you why, but I can't tell you what that's about. But again, I have to hear the medical aspects of it. But what's, God forbid, we don't believe that there's two deities. We believe there's one. So having
they're bad spirits, stuff like that. Is that part of God's judgment, stuff like that?
Well, again, why bad things happen is a whole nother discussion, which we're not going to be able to get into now, but because that has many many ways of understanding it and why things happen. That's a separate discussion. But what we need to know, the important part that we need to know is that good and evil can coexist, and the suffering of the innocent is not explained by God had a bad day and there's nothing he could do about it. That doesn't fly. It doesn't wash. So it's important for us. The name of the rabbi, there's a book I've quoted, was Harold Kushner. Again, it's a very popular book, but for some reason, some people find comfort in the book, and I don't understand it, because to me, it offers no comfort in the meaning of suffering. It's basically God had a bad day and the devil won and the bad things happened. How does that feel comforting? I don't understand. But some people find it comforting because they don't have to deal with a God who's loving, who let bad things happen. So again, I don't know, but that's not the Jewish approach. The Jewish approach is that everything comes from God and there's no two separate entities. And that's the paraduma reinforces our faith in that, reinforces that concept as well.
I agree with you that it kind of takes the agency out of your hands when you're saying like, well, there's nothing I can do about my suffering. Or there's like sometimes.
Right. No, it's saying God can't do anything about your suffering, which is to me is a very painful thing to say. What do you mean? God's in charge. He can do whatever he wants. I'll share a story. I use the story all the time. But it popped into my head now, so I'll share it with you now. There was a fellow who worked in before pre-World War II in a factory, and one day the machine in the factory sliced off the skin on his palm. Very painful, and they did a skin graft from his leg and put it on his hand. But they didn't do such a professional job in those days, and he had hair follicles still growing from his leg on his hand. He ended up having hair on his palm. World War II comes, the Nazis grab his sister off the street and take her to Gestapo headquarters, and he decides he's going to do something brazen and foolish and go in there and demand that his sister be released, which the Surgeon General would have determined is not exactly good for one's health. But he came and he said, I want my sister. And the Gestapo officer decided to have fun with him and said, sure, I'll give you your sister when you go hair on your palm. And he opened his hand and he had hair in his palm. And the Nazi went crazy and released him. He's a witch. Released the sister, released him, and let him go. Till that moment, was he upset that he had hair on his palm? Yeah, people shaking his hand, right? Bad news. And all of a sudden, what happened? In 1 second, it saved his sister's life, right? So what looks bad isn't always bad. We just don't always see it. So that's just one understanding of that. All right. So one of the things used when they do the procedure of the golden heifer is, of the red heifer is they use cedar wood and also grass. Now the cedar wood represents cedar. A cedar tree grows high and tall. That represents being boastful. The grass is low. That represents having humility. So what's good, having humility or being boastful?
You have to have both.
So we have to, well, being boastful is not a good thing per se, but appreciating who you are is important. So the Simcha B'nai Pshishka has a beautiful thought. There's a verse that says, we learned that B'shvili Nivra Olam, the world, we should know that the world was created for me. Person needs to believe that the world wasn't created for me. That's why God created Adam first. All other species are created, all the animals, all the lions, all the birds, all the fish were created at the same time. Only man was created singularly to teach us that the entire world was created for each and every one of us individually. On the other hand, there's another verse that says, "Ani offer ve'efer." Avrohom said, "I'm dust and ashes. I'm nothing." So Rav Pshuska has a beautiful idea. He says a person should have two papers. One that says, "B'shvili nivra," the world was created for me, and the other one is, "Ani offer ve'efer," and keep both papers in the pocket. Now, the papers in the pocket are very important to have, and you have to know when to pull out the paper. Sometimes you have to pull out "the world was created for me," and sometimes you have to pull out the paper of "I'm dust and ashes." When do you do what? And that's when you play the Jeopardy music. When do you do what? When it's time to do the right thing, or maybe you're hesitant, or "I'm not sure I could do it," then you have to remember the world was created for me. When it's time to do the wrong thing, then you got to pull out the other paper and say, "I'm dust and ashes." That wouldn't be appropriate for me to do that. So humility is an important component when it's time to do the wrong thing. Back off. Before you get into a fight, think about, is this the right thing to do? When you think about doing the right thing, but you feel, "I don't know if I can do it." No, the world was created for me. I have to stand up and do the right thing. It's a very nice, beautiful, both ideas. So, moving right along on page 841, the verse 14 says, "This is the teaching regarding a man who would die in a tent. Anything that enters the tent and anything that is in the tent shall be contaminated for 7 days." This is some of the laws related to tumas meis, for the impurity of touching a dead body. Even if you didn't touch the dead body, if you're in the room where there's a dead body present, a person has that ritual impurity. Now, I want to mention, just as an aside, we are all assumed to have ritual impurity that way. That's why we don't go onto the Temple Mount. But a Kohen, someone who potentially could work in the temple, has to be careful even today not to become ritually unclean by touching a dead body unnecessarily. So that's why a Kohen doesn't go into a cemetery usually, and doesn't go into a room where there's a dead body, et cetera, et cetera. Now, yes, please, Phyllis.
The doctor, or they prevented them, and if they're a Cohen, if they're doing surgeries or whatever, they might.
Well, it depends. That's why certain professions would be challenging for doctors, especially if they have to work on cadavers. Some of the training takes place on cadavers, so that could be a problem. But assuming that wouldn't be, but like a dermatologist, if you didn't have to work on a cadaver, so a dermatologist is not a doctor that necessarily is going to deal with dead bodies. That I don't know. So it depends on the training. That's the issue. Yeah, that's correct. So interestingly enough, the Hebrew word is v'zel in verse 14 is Zos HaTorah. This is the Torah, a person who dies in the tent. So our sages learn a very interesting thing out from this verse, that the Zos HaTorah, you want to acquire Torah, you have to be willing to kill yourself for it. It's not just a subject that you just, in passing, I'll decide. You have to acquire it by, quote, killing yourself for it. So a good example of that would be the story about a man who he busy at work all the time, and he's getting a little older, and he realizes, I'm not putting in enough time for study, and before I know it, I'm going to meet my maker, and God's going to say, "No, did you study Torah?" And I said, "I don't know, I didn't have time. I was busy working here, there, shmir." So he decides that's it. he's not going to go into work right away this morning. He's going to go in later because he wants to study in the study hall from Torah. So he goes to the study hall after morning services and he's learning Torah. And a little boy comes and says, your wife said I should call you because there are customers outside the store. So he says, tell her I died. So the little kid is pretty simple and goes back, he died. Ah! And she's all hysterical. And 2 hours later, he comes home. Phil, you're alive. Why did you say you're alive? There were customers waiting. He says, what would have happened if I died? If I died, the customers would have done something else, gone something else, or come back another time. I died. When I'm learning, I'm dead. I'm dead. That's it. So to make the time we have for learning holy and say, make believe, quote, I died during this time. No phone calls, no other things. I'm busy now. That's how you acquire Torah, by really making a priority. It's not like, well, when I have nothing else to do and I'm in the mood and everything's okay, then I'll learn a little bit. It has to be a real important priority. That's what our sages tell us here. In this week's portion, we also have the death of Miriam. Who was Miriam? Anybody? Moses and Aaron's sister, correct. Now, when Miriam dies, there's something that was there in her merit, the well of water. That was there in the merit of Miriam. And when she died, guess what happened? Dried up. So one of the commentaries say, why did God make it dry up? So that people should realize that it was there only in her merit. So when she wasn't there anymore, there wasn't water there. And in fact, the three major miracles that the Jewish people had, one was the well that accompanied them in the desert for 40 years. What else? Anyone think of any other miracles they had in the desert? The what?
The clouds of glory.
The clouds of glory, good. And the manna from heaven, the man, the food. So the man, that was in the merit of the Torah of Moshe. The clouds of glory was related to Aaron, and the water was Miriam. And this is interesting because the commentaries again tell us that the world stands on three things: on the study of Torah, the service of God, and acts of love and kindness. So Torah, that was Moshe. Aaron was service; he served in the temple, in the Mishkan, right, in the tabernacle. And Miriam, her life was dedicated to acts of love and kindness. So what ended up happening is that there was no water, so the people protested, and Moshe and Aaron go and get upset that the people are upset, and what ends up happening is Moshe, instead of speaking to the rock, which was God said he should speak to the rock, it says he strikes it and he hits it. And because of that, God is upset. Why is God upset? First of all, he's upset that he got angry. There's a very beautiful book called the Igeres HaRamban, the letter of the Ramban, which is a letter to his children. And in it, he talks to them about Ramban. The Ramban was Nachmanides, the great Torah scholar. And he talks about the importance of not getting angry. And that's one of the themes of his letter. It's called Igeres HaRamban, the letter of Ramban. It's been translated in our school called A Letter for the Ages. I might have a copy. Maybe next week, maybe I'll give you some copies of it. Very, very nice. And what happens is people don't have the same standard. God doesn't have the same standard for everybody. Just like, in the Army, there's the standard Army, but then if you're a Navy SEAL, that's already a different level. So the Navy SEALs, they're trained very well. What happens if you come in second place? You know what they call that when you come in second place in the Navy SEALs? You came in last first, right? Because they have a standard, a very high standard. Everyone's become first. You got to be first. You got to be fast. So Hashem judges the righteous on a much higher standard. So because Moshe got upset, and because Moshe hit the rock, therefore Moshe was punished that he would not be able to enter the land of Israel. Now, what would have been the benefit of Moshe just talking to the rock instead of hitting the rock? So one of the answers given is that if the rock listened to the words of Moshe, how much more so should we listen to the words of Moshe? The rock understood that you have to listen to what Moshe says, then how much more so should we? Also, it would have been a greater Kiddush Hashem, a greater sanctification of God's name that was now diminished. So because of this, Moshe and Aaron would not be given permission to enter the land. Next, we have in the Parsha, running out of time, and we didn't get to the other Parsha yet. Okay. The Jewish people want to go into the land of Sichon, and they say, nope, we're not going to let you pass. Even though, we're going to take the roads and we're not going to do anything, they didn't allow, and they were refused, even though they're willing to pay. Now, what's interesting here is Moshe is willing to go try to take the shortcut into the land. Why is that interesting? What's the outcome of the Jewish people taking a shortcut into the land? The personal outcome to Moshe? He's going to die earlier because God just said he's not going to enter the land. They get a shortcut, but Moshe doesn't care about himself. He cares about the Jewish people. He wants them to go into the land as soon as possible. And so even though he'll die earlier, but they refused. Then comes the death of Aaron. The death of Aaron, again, this is after the 40 years in the desert. The death of Aaron is something that causes tremendous pain to the Jewish people. Why? Because Aaron always pursued peace. Aaron always tried to make peace between couples and enemies, and everybody wept for the loss of Aaron. And by the way, ultimately the well was restored and the clouds of glory were destroyed in the merit of Moshe. So everybody wept for him. But the type of death that Aaron had was one that Moshe wanted. What kind of death was that? It's called Misas Neshika, which means the death of a kiss. Normally, the soul wants to leave the body because the body is so involved in the physical. The soul always wants to go up to heaven. But in a righteous person, that's not how the soul doesn't mind staying. But when God's presence comes close, and so to speak, God kisses the person, then the soul is automatically attracted to God and leaves the body that way. And that's how Aaron died and Miriam died, and Moshe said he would like to have the same type of death. He wants to have that death of the kiss of God that pulls the soul out that way. There's other things that we can talk about, but I do want to get into a little bit of the second portion, which is Balak. Balak is a very interesting portion because the Jewish people are sort of on the outside of the story, except at the very end, which we'll find out about. the Jewish people are sort of outside the story. It's about Balak, who was a Moabite king, and he sees that the Jews are conquering all the enemies along the way. And he's very nervous. He doesn't want that to happen. So he decides to send a message to Bilam. Bilam was a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, not a good guy. He promoted not good behavior among the people. He was not an inspiration, but he was able to have conversations with God. And what happened was, he said, what's the power of Moshe? And the power of Moshe was what? His power of prayer, of speech, right? So he said, hey, wait a second. We've been trying to fight them our way. Let's fight them with speech. And he wanted to hire Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet, to curse the Jewish people. If Moshe's power with speech, we'll use that power to conquer him. That was his strategy. And he sent a message to Bilam, and Bilam said, again, he asked the Midianites, what's his power, the power of speech? And he said, let's curse him. And this, by the way, is the same thing that Yitzchak, Isaac, told Yaakov when he came for the blessings. He said, Ha-kol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob, by Yadayim Yadeh, Esau, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And literally what he meant was, it sounds like Yaakov, but the hands feel like Esau because he was hairy, because he had the animal skin on it. But the deeper meaning of what Yitzchak meant was the power of the Jewish people or the power of speech through prayer and Torah study, and the power of Esau is the power of his hands. So this is an important lesson for us that, you know, they had a prophet, but the question is what you use the prophet. And a lot of times we think, if only I was educated, if only I was born to a Jewish family or a religious family, all we need is the willingness to grow and change. That's what's important. What other things that happen, everybody is put into the situation that God wants them to be in. Bilam says to the messengers, stay the night. And Hashem says, who are these people? And Bilam says, hey, God doesn't know? Maybe I could trick God. And Bilam should have answered, God, you know everything. You know who these people are. But he answers, no, these are the people. They want me to curse them. God says, no, I don't want you to don't go with them. Because the Jewish people are blessed and you can't curse them. And like Rashi says, like we tell the bee, don't give us your honey, don't give us your sting. We'll pass on both. But Bilam is still vying for working to get the gig. So the next morning he tells her, I can't go with you, implying that if there was somebody of greater authority and more prominent, then maybe I would go. And implying he didn't get enough honor. And he implies he wants more money. So they send another, and again, but God says, you want to go with them? Yeah, but you can only say what I want you to say. And what's the problem here? Did God change his mind? No, but he knew Bilam really wanted to go. So he says, okay. Again, the way a person wants to go, God gives us free choice. And we need to, when we pray, by the way, it's a good idea to pray for God, whatever's best for me should happen. I know a prominent rabbi who told me that his daughter was dating somebody, and he very much hoped that that match would happen. And thank God, God didn't listen to him, and she got a much better young man to marry. So sometimes we think we know what's best for us. We don't. Say, God, whatever's best for us, that's what should happen. So what happens is that he says, okay, I can go with you. Of course, he doesn't say the terms of employment. They can only bless the Jewish people. He can't curse them. And he got up early and loads up his donkey. And Hashem says, sorry, Avram beat you. Avram, to fulfill my will, loaded up his donkey even before you. So why was Bilam so excited? It's involved the determination of doing the wrong thing. I was asked to give a class after 9/11. And one of the points that I made that I think is a valid point is, do you know that the Arabs that tried destroying the Twin Towers earlier, they rented a truck and put a bomb in it and blew it up in the basement and it ended up not working. And they were caught, the Arabs were caught. FBI did some good research and they found where the truck came from, where they rented it from, and they caught the Arabs. And they had a trial, and they were leaving the trial by helicopter. And the federal officers that were taking them opened up the window of the helicopter and said, it's still standing, looking at the Twin Towers. And the Arab answered something very eerie, which unfortunately they didn't take seriously. Had we had more money, it wouldn't be standing anymore. Meaning to say, had we gotten a big enough bomb? And that's why eventually they came up with the idea of the airplanes, which costed them nothing to destroy the Twin Towers that way. And what we can learn from that is the concept of determination. We should be so determined to do good like they were determined to do bad. That took tremendous determination. What they did, they went to flying school, they learned how to fly a plane, and they hijacked it and crashed themselves into to kill everybody on the plane and to kill thousands of people. That took determination. We need to learn, not in a bad way, for a good way, for do the right thing, that we should have determination, because that's something that, and here Bilam's all excited, he's going, and he's traveling along, and the donkey is not going straight. God was angry that he decided to go, so God put an angel in front of him. And interestingly enough, it was an angel of mercy.
Sir, bringing it back, my exchanges.
I'm sorry?
I have the receipt.
I can't hear you, Michael. Okay. It was an angel of mercy. And the donkey saw the angel, Bilam did not. So the donkey turned away from the road and went into the field. Bilam was all angry. Hey, where you going off the road? And he starts hitting him. And the angel came in front of him again. He went to the fence on the side, and the donkey saw the angel again and pressed Bilam's leg against the wall. And he kept on hitting it. The angel went further and in a narrow path, and there was no room for right or left. And the donkey again saw the angel and just stopped. And Bilam was so angry, and he's hitting the donkey because he didn't understand what was going on. And the donkey starts speaking. And the donkey says, "What have I done to you that you struck me these 3 times?" And Bilam says, "Because you made fun of me. If I had a sword, I'd kill you." And the donkey says, "Am I not the donkey that you have ridden all your life? Have I usually done something like this?" He said, "Nope." And now all of a sudden, Hashem opened Bilam's eyes, and he was able to see the angel with the sword. And it's interesting, the 3 times represent Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and also the 3 times represent the 3 major holidays. But let me just say a side point. Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, the very powerful and Rosh Yeshiva, the dean of the Mir Yeshiva in Israel of blessed memory, he said, "The donkey talks to you and you answer." What did he mean by that? Anyone have an idea? What did he mean by that? What's the critique that Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz of blessed memory said? Anybody? The donkey is talking to you and you answer?
That you believe in an animal that's at your level that you can speak to.
Right. You see, we live in a time where the hierarchy in the movies is kids or animals are on the highest level. That's who have the wisdom. Next are the women, and last place are the men. And that's a very bad thing because it mixes up what our values are. You're a human. You have an elevated soul. You have a purpose on this world. The donkey talking to you should not be who you're talking to. That shouldn't be having a conversation with him. It's really, there was an old television show many years ago, I think in the 50s, called Father Knows Best. You can never get away with a title like that today. Now, in Father Knows Best, the father didn't always know best, but he was made to believe that he knew best. And that's okay. That's okay. It creates a hierarchy. We live in very confused times. There's a veterinarian place not far from here that their advertisement says, animals are people too. They're not. They're not. And we need to know that there is a real difference between animals and people. And unfortunately, society has gotten very confused about it. Many years ago, remember, they used to use the heart of a baboon for heart transplants, and people would protest outside the hospital, "Save the baboons!" Using an animal's heart to save a human being. They don't use that baboon's heart anymore, I don't think. They have artificial hearts that are better. But it's a misdiagnosis of what our value system needs to be.
You say something in society, you're seen as a bad person.
I'm sorry?
You say something in society.
You don't have to say something, but the problem is we need to have a better, we have to look through the world in a Torah lens. I said on Shabbos, there's the tragedy, it's on the news about the submarine that imploded. So it's a sad story, 5 people died. But I look at that story, and this past week, an Arab terrorist came to a gas station in Israel and shot and killed 4 people that were doing nothing wrong. These 5 people, some of them spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a peek at the Titanic. And again, it's a tragedy. I'm not, people dying is a tragedy. But how do you compare these four people that were in the gas station were minding their own business, doing their own thing, and an Arab came and took a machine gun and just killed them for nothing? To me, that's a much greater tragedy than the other one. So we have to learn to have Torah lenses to look at. How do we look at what's going on in the world? And interestingly enough, the angel killed the donkey at this point. Why? To save, for two reasons. First of all, they didn't want anyone worshiping God didn't want anyone worshiping the speaking animal. And two, to save Bilam, the wicked Bilam, save him shame. People should say, oh, that's the donkey that shamed Bilam. To allow the human to have some dignity. So interesting. Again, it's a different way that we look at it. And our sages tell us something interesting. Woe is to us on the day of judgment, is woe to us on the day of reproof. If Bilam, the wisest of men of the Gentile nations, could not refute the donkey's reproof and was humiliated by it, what profound shame shall we experience on the great day of judgment when the Almighty Himself will recall our failures? So this is the oral tradition tells us this. So it's again a fascinating idea. So what ends up happening is, all right, I'll just cut to the chase a little bit. What ends up happening is that Bilam comes again and again, and he can only bless the Jewish people. And Balak is really fuming because he wanted to curse the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Balak says, that Bilam says, is "Matayvu ayalecha Yaakov," how goodly are the tents of Jacob. And it's talking about the tents of Jacob, is referring to the Jewish homes and the shuls and the study halls and the temple, and that is included in our prayer service. And here's a very powerful line. When we understand that we are just passing through this world and that our ultimate destination is the next world, we're able to focus on the pursuits laid out in the Torah. Pursuits of permanent, enduring value. The home, the shul, the house of learning are the three keystones of Jewish existence. And that's what Balak himself was able to see. How godly are your tents. I just want to conclude with an interesting story. And one of the things that he said was, it's a nation that dwells alone. Chapter 23, verse 9. The nation that will dwell in solitude, not be reckoned among the nations. And what happened was, it was after the liberation, after World War II, and people were gathered together, and a representative of the Russian government wanted that those that came from Russia should return to their beloved homeland, promising them all the different types of goodies that they could have if they came back. But he was very angry at one woman, Pessia was her name, who was a religious woman who maintained her religious belief even after the war. And he ended up his speech and he said, "Hooray for Stalin." And he promised the woman all wonderful things. And Pessia showed her the Shabbos lights that they had lit before Shabbos. These are the Shabbos lights. They'll go out, but meanwhile, they are aflame. I want to be in the presence of the Shabbos lights. And the man was really angry at her. And she said, "You're a Jew," he told this Russian officer. "I can tell." "When you told me that you hate me, then I knew you were a Jew as well." And what ended up happening was it's your inner identity that's calling out for to identify. And then he broke down and said, "Yes, I am a Jew. My mother prays that her son will return to the path of the fathers. But I dedicated the best years of my life to the great and mighty Russia. Until the war, I was content with my life. When the Germans invaded Ukraine, my best non-Jewish friends gleefully delivered my wife and children into the hands of the murderers. They all burnt. My friends called me Yuda, Jew. So I thought my only solution was to bury my Judaism even deeper into the grave of my innermost heart and suffocate it completely." He turned to them and said, "Good Shabbos." So a nation that dwells alone, many people think that if we assimilate, if we act like the non-Jews, then anti-Semitism will be over. It's not how it works. When we act independently, then we have a chance of survival. When we assimilate, it doesn't work that way. The Meshech Chochmah said this pre-World War II, and even recently, there's a famous non-Jewish writer from England, Melanie, I forgot her last name. She wrote a powerful article about this idea. Jews think by assimilating, that's how we're going to stop anti-Semitism, and it does not work. It's being proud of who we are and happy with who we are, and being respectful of the nations of the world on one hand, but on the other hand, maintaining our value system. That's how we survive. So again, a lot of interesting things to talk about, but you got a taste now of Chukas and Balak, the double portion of this week. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, Elisha.
One of the things that always I find sort of puzzling is whether or not Balaam had freedom of choice in the interaction. When he went down and gave a bracha instead of a curse. I mean, he went, of course, with intending to do bad, I guess. But
yes, that was his intent. He thought he'd get away with it, but he didn't. Yes.
But did he, since his mind somehow changed, did he have freedom of choice at that moment where he gave a bracha instead?
He had freedom of choice, but as we see, I didn't get to it, but he gave the idea of that, trying to get the Jewish men to sin. So that was his idea. So he had freedom of choice. Hashem did force him a little bit that he couldn't curse. So he doesn't get any great credit for the blessings that he gave. But he was not a good guy. And like I said, he was the one who came up with the idea, which we're going to talk about next week, about how to get the Jewish people to sin so that they should get punished that way. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
I have a question.
Go ahead, David.
Why does Balak get a name of a chapter of the Torah for him? I mean, I know the stories.
It's a good question. It's a good question. He doesn't deserve it. But what ends up happening is the the wicked get punished, and there's a certain virtue in us seeing that as well. But your question's a good one. Any other thoughts, comments? All right, everybody, have a great week. Any other questions or thoughts? Feel free to call me, email, or call.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Michelle, Malka, Yehudis,
Bye-bye.
Nor, David, Elisheva, Malka
Thanks, Rabbi.
Griggs.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank
Michael,
you.
how are you doing in Detroit?
Oh, Rabbi, yeah, I'm doing fine. We were at the Kollel a couple weeks ago. We had a brunch for Rosh Chodesh.
Very nice.
There was a drash on when are we allowed to steal?
When are we allowed to steal?
Steal. Yeah, it's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Do not steal,
Yeah.
right?
I can think of Pesach the Afikomen.
Okay, no, that wasn't one of the answers, but it sounds like it might work. Did you want to hear one he said?
Please, go ahead.
It was when he gave an example, like when maybe your child needs a medication and it's so outrageously expensive, and it was the only thing that would save his life. You're allowed to steal it, but you have to have the intention of repaying.
Of repaying it
Whatever.
later, at a later date. To save a life, you can steal, that's correct. But again, you do have to pay it back. Correct, very good. Thank
And
you.
that was basically it. I'm trying to remember any other examples he might have given us, but yeah, that's the time you're allowed to steal when a life is at stake. So that was
Very
kind of
good.
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Take good care, Michael.
Thank you.
Malka, how you doing? Okay?
Take care.
Thank you.
Doing fine, thank you. I'm going to Chicago in a couple of days. Just spend about 5 or 10 days there.
All right, I was just there, actually. One of my people, he got married there, so I officiated a wedding.
Mazel tov.
Yeah, it's very nice.
What's the name? Maybe I know them.
Well, they're from here, Wyckoff, so you don't know their name, but
Oh, okay. No problem. I used to live in Chicago, that's why.
all right. Malka, how you doing?
Fine, thank you, Rabbi. All
Good to see you.
good. Baruch Hashem.
Very
Yes,
good.
thank you.
Take care of yourselves. All the best. You know, David, Michael, Malka, take care. Have a great week.
You
Thank
as
you.
well, Rabbi.
Amen. Thank you. Bye-bye.